So welcome everyone to the inaugural Digital Discussions webinar. My name is Rhiannon, I'm the founder of Crest Communications, and I'm delighted to host today's session. We've got Matt Dowling, CEO of Freelancer Club, and we've also got Philip King, the Small Business Commissioner. So both Matt and Philip are heavily involved in the fight to ensure freelancers and the self-employed are heard, supported and protected. They've both been flying the flag, both organisations, for this community for many years through campaigning and lobbying. But over the past 2 months, which I think it's fair to say has been a torrid and heartbreaking time for many in the freelance, self-employed and small business community, they've really been working around the clock to make sure those concerns are heard and communicated to decision makers and policy makers. So today we're going to be discussing both Matt and Philip's roles in that, what they're currently doing and pushing for, their thoughts on the self-employed income support scheme, what the future holds, and critical issues like chasing unpaid invoices, which are really proving incredibly critical for a range of freelancers at the moment. We've had some questions submitted already, so we'll definitely be addressing those as many as we can. If any of you have questions, on the chat function to the right-hand side, you can privately message me as the co-host. We'll try and address as many of them as we can during the session. For those we can't, we'll either aim to get back to you privately or address them in future sessions. So apologies if we can't get through them all. We're just going to kick off by having Matt and Philip introduce themselves and their respective roles and organisations, and then we'll launch into the questions. So let's start with you, Matt, for an intro.
Yeah, hi. So Matt Dowling, founder of Freelancer Club. Our objective with our club is to support our community of creative freelancers. We also do a lot of work around campaigning, starting with a no free work campaign we launched about 5 years ago, to the current campaign that we're pushing to try and find as much financial support for freelancers as possible. We're also trying to get companies working again and engaging with freelancers to try and see if we can reignite the freelance economy, and a bunch of other bits and pieces along the way that I'm sure we'll get into.
Great, thanks Matt. And over to you, Philip.
Thanks, Rhiannon. So the Small Business Commissioner exists to support businesses that are suffering with late payment from their larger customers. We do that in 3 ways. We do that by offering advice and signposting and help in terms of a website and caseworkers who can help. We do it from a point of view of mediation. So when large businesses are not paying their smaller suppliers, we can get involved and generate cash doing that. We've collected £6.9 million so far, and we're there waiting to collect more, and we've done quite a lot this week. I can share that later on. And we are trying to change culture. So I'm getting heavily engaged with the chief execs of large businesses that are behaving in a way that I think is not that helpful, and talking to them about how they could be behaving differently. I'm also writing to the big businesses that are doing the right thing and thanking them on behalf of the small business community. Alongside that, of course, we're working with government and officials and policy people to raise issues that we hear from small businesses.
Fantastic. And I think invoices and also the behaviour of certain businesses compared to others is something we're definitely going to touch on today. Just quickly going back to you, Matt. So you mentioned your various campaigning and what you're currently doing at the moment. There was a huge amount of relief when the provisions for freelancers and self-employed were announced by the Chancellor, but sort of as things have transpired, it appears that there's quite a lot of critical gaps that people are falling through. What do you think the government needs to do now to address those, and is there hope for those who aren't currently covered?
Yeah, the initial announcement was very encouraging. We'd campaigned for a while along with a lot of others, and so to get any form of announcement brought a huge amount of relief to a lot of people. So the areas that we would very much be involved with are the stories on the ground. So we're hearing the realities, and the fact that some support was made available made a big difference initially. As it settled, we started to realize that a fair chunk of the 5 million self-employed currently in the UK were not going to get that support. So we estimate about 2 million of the 5 are either not going to be applicable for support or not going to receive support that's going to have any significant impact on their lives. So we'd like to see a couple of measures put in that we feel are realistic and viable. One is we would like for the most recent tax returns to be considered. There's technology available to make that a very easy process. and something that one of our partners has offered up to government as a means to do that. And the other is if we were to look at ways in which we could get payments to freelancers prior to June. The government definitely seems to have a picture in their mind of what a freelancer looks like, and it's very much not the picture that we have or the reality that I think exists. Most of the freelancers we're supporting are living paycheck to paycheck. They are in need of funds immediately just to pay rent, to feed their family, the really critical and crucial aspects that we see are imminently important. So for us, we'd like to see a bit of a shake on, and if there's a way to get funds to people sooner who have already provided all the information required, that would make a massive difference. So we'd be keen to focus on those two areas to begin with, and then maybe open up discussions in one or two other spaces to see what else is possible.
I think the point you make about, freelancers and the self-employed need money now, rent's due, bills are due, that sort of ties in very nicely, Philip, with the work you're doing around unpaid invoices. Obviously, if money from the government and various schemes is yet to be forthcoming for some, ensuring that getting paid for work already done, already committed to, comes through is incredibly critical. What are you sort of hearing about on your side at the Small Business Commission, and what are you advising those affected to do?
Well, I think clearly, there is a contract in place, and goods or services have been supplied, and they should be paid for. And that's no different from normal, but it's currently more critical right now than it ever has been. And I think that we need to encourage businesses to take a tough line and not to sit back and hope money is going to arrive. So they need to be really vigorously chasing and getting in the face of people that owe them money that haven't paid it. There are all sorts of measures available. There's late payment interest, there's legal action, there's all sorts of things. But right now, my view is that we need businesses, whether they're large or small, to be having real honest conversations. And I'm encouraging small businesses where they've got an outstanding debt from a large customer to get in and talk to that customer. It may not be the accounts payable team. It may be the person that talked to them originally and placed the contract or the order. It may be someone that they've been working with within the business. But often there's somebody internally who can bat for you. And if you can get them on side and get them to be making the right calls and sending the right emails and pushing the right people for you, that can often help. We'll perhaps come on to a bit later on about large businesses that are misbehaving. But I think it's really important that small businesses are making their large customers aware of the impact that they're suffering. And if genuinely a freelancer is struggling to feed the family, they need to make their large customer aware of that, because very often large businesses work in a transactional sense. They don't think about the reality of the people they're dealing with, and we need to get them to do that.
And I think actually it's something worth touching on now, because I know that Freelancer Club are hearing from a lot of individuals who are struggling to track people down. Office numbers are no longer live, people aren't where you normally find them, some businesses themselves are struggling, the ones that owe money. So are you seeing any trends? Is it the big businesses who are simply drawing up the drawbridge and protecting cash flow, or is it sort of the small, medium-sized players who simply can't afford to pay out right now?
Well, I think it's a mixture of both, Rhiannon. So we are seeing, in my view, we're seeing a divergence. So we're seeing some businesses who are doing absolutely the right thing. Morrison's early on announced they would pay their smallest suppliers immediately, and they recategorized the definition of a small business as one that turned over £1 million a year rather than 100,000. Waitrose did some stuff last week. Vodafone have. Taylor Wimpey announced last weekend they were going to pay it forward, so smallest contractors got paid for 3 months' work in advance of doing the work in order to help keep them in business. And so we're seeing some really good practice out there. We're also seeing some much less good practice, in the sense that large businesses are just sending out a blanket email to their entire supply chain saying, sorry, there's no money till COVID-19 is over, or we're going to add 30 days or 60 days or 90 days to our standard terms. You could argue whether that's legal or not, because there may well be a contract and payment terms that make that a breach of contract, but that doesn't help you if money isn't arriving. And the reality there is that those businesses are not thinking about the impact they're having on their supply chain. So what I've been doing is, in the cases where we're seeing good practice, I'm writing on behalf of small business and thanking them for what they're doing. And for large businesses that are behaving badly, I'm writing to the chief exec and asking to have a conversation with them. And I'm pleased to say that in at least 2 cases so far, I have had conversations with chief execs. They have listened, and one major high street name I talked to last Thursday paid 170 small suppliers on that day and released £500,000 to the smallest suppliers on that day. And that was because, I think that was because I highlighted to them the human impact of what they were doing. And you know, they may have saved £5 million off their sort of working capital bottom line by not paying people. But as I said earlier, quite often that means that a small business is just unable to feed the family or find a really vital payment that they need. So I think big businesses are getting smarter at that. And if I may share one other anecdote, a wholesaler of plants to garden centres was talking to us a few weeks ago and was suffering a similar problem. And we talked to that, his customer, and their finance director is now saying that they can't afford to pay all their suppliers, much as they'd like to, and they're having to take tough decisions. But what they are doing now is setting up the process so small suppliers can talk to them. And if they're small and they're struggling, they will find money for them. And if they can't pay the full bill, they'll pay at least some money as an on-account payment to tide things over. That is really encouraging for me because, you know, we can't expect that no business is going to make no bad decisions because everyone's got to manage, you know, cash flow and try and survive. But we can do that in a climate of collaboration rather than confrontation. And that's my big mantra at the moment, is getting people to collaborate with their supply chain and talk to them.
And just quickly, is this if the individual who's chasing that or those invoices really feels completely at sea and disempowered and doesn't really know where to start, is that something they can come to the Commission for advice on?
Absolutely. Absolutely right. Yep. smallbusinesscommissioner.gov.uk. I have a team of caseworkers who are happy and waiting to talk to small businesses that are suffering and struggling to get paid. We can, in some cases, formally get involved and take action. Where we can't, then what my team are doing is just having informal conversations with businesses. And we last week generated a payment of £91,000 for a small business that was about to go under as a result of a conversation we had. And in several cases, we've generated and released funds of 400 or 500 quid, which sounds really insignificant, but as you know, as your members will know, can be really significant to a freelancer. And I think there's no doubt that a call from the Small Business Commissioner is likely to have a bit more clout than a call from an independent small business. And very often what we find is that we get involved and the business may not even come back to us and talk to us, and yet a payment suddenly appears in the bank account of the freelancer. So yes, we're there waiting to talk to people and help them. And where we can't help, we can signpost to other people that can. And I should have said it's a free service, so there is no charge for that service.
Absolutely, that's really important. And just before we come back to you, Matt, Philip, very quickly, have you seen an increase in inquiries to the Commission for your caseworkers, or do you think it's yet to come as the dust settles?
We've seen a marginal increase, but it's not a spike yet, if I'm honest. We are expecting that. I think in a lot of cases, payments were already in the system and working their way through. A month into the lockdown, we're now going to be at a point where we're going to see things that weren't approved when they should have been a month ago and not coming through. So we are bracing ourselves for a surge in coming days and weeks.
And Matt, that sort of brings us on to the length of this crisis and how we're sort of moving through phases. And the indication suggests we're moving into sort of a holding pattern, as it were. And for freelancers, obviously, the inability to get back to normal when so many of them are engaged in face-to-face roles, that must be proving incredibly stressful for your members. I mean, what do you think sort of the short to medium-term future holds for that community?
Yeah, I think stressful is the right word. I think we're seeing a huge impact on people's businesses, but also people's mental health. There's a proper concern here around what's taking place now, medium term, long term. The stories we're hearing back, particularly for freelancers who have been providing face-to-face services, is that their client base got decimated overnight. If you're in an events space or anything whereby you're needed to be there in person, there's a huge amount of uncertainty. So combine that with the previous chat we were having in regards to support, and it puts you in a very strange mindset of influx and in between a rock and a hard place. We've been offering one-to-one calls with members to see if we can come up with some practical ideas, and it's been a combination and a very interesting experiment to speak to them and hear their story, to get a sense of what the reality looks like, and then to start brainstorming ideas where they might be able to adapt their business to suit a short-term online solution and provide their services in some form or another online. We did a session this week with a portrait photographer who has a studio in London, and as you can imagine, that work is stopped completely. So he's adapted by setting up tutorials online. He's looking at ways in which he can continue to utilize his core skill set, and hopefully the legacy of that for him and for many will be it can continue as we come out of this phase. So we have to try, if we can, to remain as positive as possible and do as much as we can, both practically and in a supportive role. I think there is scope now to be able to adapt, and whatever happens in the foreseeable, I don't think it's going to be a sudden shift to go back to work. The way we see it and the patterns that we're seeing is it's very unlikely that businesses are going to turn on a switch in June, July, August, and everything goes back to normal. We're reading articles on restaurants not seeing any business in Wuhan, and they've been allowed back because there's a behavioral change that has now entered the market. So it's important that we keep an eye on this and see how things are going to evolve from a freelancer standpoint. Adaptation is probably essential regardless. And I think if anybody is just hunkering down now and waiting for that switch to be turned back on, it's a risky game, and it could end up being months before any sort of normality, and a word I don't like to use, but any sort of semblance of what life was prior comes back. And that for me is a slight danger. I'd really like to see the freelance community jump into life and utilize what is one of their greatest strengths, which is creativity and the nimble nature of being a solopreneur, an individual who can pivot on a dime and change direction to adapt their business or their service to try and find a way around this current climate. There are advantages to that. We know that everybody is at home isolating. We know how to market our business in a certain way. So there are ways in which we can start to think about our businesses framed by COVID that actually make life quite easy in terms of thinking who the audience is, what are they doing, how do they feel? The answer is they probably feel the same as you do. And that in itself is something we can grab hold of and try and take advantage of to keep freelancers moving forward and to keep the mind ticking. So we're hopeful that we're going to see an adaptation amongst a lot of our members and freelancers at large and come out of it with a unique landscape and potentially a second income stream or a totally new space that is exciting and more digitally driven.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think you're quite right around needing to think sort of strategically in the medium term. What we're also seeing is sort of many people who are typically self-employed or freelance seeking out other types of employment, particularly in the short term, to sort of make ends meet. Are you concerned, because something you've campaigned for at Freelancer Club is an end to people being asked to work for free or people underselling themselves but sort of below their pay grade? Are you worried that with this influx of people looking for new jobs, talented people will, one, take jobs that they're overqualified and underpaid for, and two, it will push out junior talent who simply won't be able to get a foot in the door?
Yeah, look, the nature of the market when these things happen is there will be a shift because there is far less work out there for everybody. And what that means is everybody would be bumped down a couple of rungs. So vitally important that we support everybody in this case. Anybody who's new into the business, a freelancer that might be trying to figure things out over the past year, first of all, can't apply to the self-employed income support scheme because they're too new. And secondly, is probably not experienced enough to pick up work. In the past, that might have been a gradual and exponential growth, is now a scenario where you're competing with individuals who are far more experienced because they're willing to look at opportunities that they may not have looked at in the past. And that's the nature of the marketplace. It always has been, and now it's just highlighting that fact. So I do think there is a behavioral shift happening, and something for us to be very conscious about. When we talk a lot about companies giving things up for free and helping people out, it's a good news story, and it's often very positive, and it's legitimately often very positive. There is an unspoken knock-on effect to that, whereby people who are providing a service in that same space have suddenly lost a job, and it's completely reduced the value of that position overnight. So it's just something to be conscious of, as I feel there's a gray area brewing, and that when we start to move out of this, there might be a behavioral mindset to say, well, you know what, all this stuff should be free or very low cost anyway. We've seen it with Spotify and the music industry, Netflix and the TV and film space. Freelancers have always been seen as somewhat in a charitable eye, and I'm very conscious not to do that. Freelancers contributed billions to the economy and are highly valuable, and something that we should be embracing and looking at with a lot of gratitude, particularly in a post-Brexit Britain, whereby we have one of the most sought after assets out there, which is the creativity and imagination of freelancers. So I am conscious not to look down upon freelancers as charity cases to try and help out, but rather a vital asset that should be nurtured and not to be kicking the golden goose. So striking that balance is tricky. But important that bigger businesses particularly don't push freelancers to the back of the queue, but just recognize the value that they're bringing and pay them fairly. So I think there's a lot for us to get our head around, both in terms of practical things we can do in that space, but also in the behavioral mindset and the way in which things are going to take place and take hold as we come out of this.
I think that's a really interesting point, and one that'd be interesting to get your thoughts on, Philip, around the cultural shift we might see as a result of this. Do you think we'll, going forward in sort of the medium to long term, see a reticence from people to start small businesses, to become entrepreneurs or freelancers? And do you think as a result, sort of big business will get bigger? Is that something you're concerned about?
No, if I'm honest, Rhiannon, I don't. I think that, you know, in previous recessions, certainly the financial crisis, we saw an emergence of entrepreneurs and small businesses come out of that. And I think we're likely to see the same thing now, because I think we're going to see a lot of people who are spending a lot of time at home with time on their hands, who are going to be thinking and being creative, as Matt refers to, and will come up with ideas that post the crisis they can introduce. And I hope that we'll see an emergence of more creativity and more entrepreneurs rather than less. I was fascinated by Matt's reference to photographer. One of the first webinars I did when we sort of started this lockdown situation was a freelance photographer there who literally started in February as a freelance photographer, had 12 weddings booked for the summer, which had all been cancelled, and was telling how she had moved to fixed life photography for agencies and stuff, and was doing really well in a completely different sphere of photography from what she'd entered into. And I think that's a sort of thing that businesses and entrepreneurs need to do. Matt referred to the value, and I think that's really important. One of the things that I get incredibly frustrated by is micro businesses, small businesses, freelancers who say, I have no choice. If my large customer says they're going to pay me on 90 days, I have to accept that. And I absolutely refute that. I mean, there are times when that's the case, but very often it's not. If you're a freelancer and you've got fleet of foot, flexibility, and the ability to support a big business, they want you and they need you, and you have a real value. And at the point at which you're talking about, setting the relationship up, you have some power and you need to use it. And I think it's not always the case that small businesses need to and should roll over. They really need to recognize their own value. And too often they don't. They think that because they're small, they have to do what the big business wants them to do. And very often that's not the case.
And is there anything else, obviously, the incredibly hands-on and effective support your team are offering? Is there anything that you personally are lobbying government for? Is there anything you're pushing to sort of have implemented on a policy scale or potentially a more cultural scale, and that you think could make a difference at the moment?
Not specifically, but we clearly have, we're uniquely positioned to hear from a lot of small businesses. I'm doing many webinars like this where I'm getting feedback and hearing from small businesses. So I'm feeding what I hear into the Treasury, and the issues that Matt raised early on about the gaps that have opened up in some of the provisions. And as every scheme gets launched and we see the benefits, we also very quickly see the downsides and the gaps and the things that need to be addressed. So I don't have a direct route into government, but I do have routes into policy teams and so on. And I use that to share the concerns I'm hearing and push them back into government. And I think what we're seeing is, increasingly those things are being listened to. Alok Sharma yesterday announced the changes to prevent landlords taking aggressive action with retailers and so on. And I think we are seeing, and there's talk this morning that the Chancellor's looking at the possibility of bigger than 80% support for the smallest loans. I have no idea where that's going to end up. But what it does say to me is that these concerns are being listened to. And I think that the voice of people like Matt and organisations like his is really important.
Fantastic. And then if we could end on a slightly more positive note, I mean, you've both mentioned several sort of during the course of your conversation, but something to be potentially cheerful about. What are you sort of seeing as the silver linings in the situation? Maybe start with you, Philip.
I think the silver lining that I'm seeing is I've never been so busy as I have been the last 3 weeks. And I thought working from home would be a bit of a doddle. It clearly isn't. And I'm getting a huge amount done. So this webinar this morning has taken, so far 45 minutes. If I was doing this face-to-face with Matt somewhere in London, it would have been, getting there, sitting down, sorting it out, having a coffee. And I'm having, every day I'm having tens of conversations with people, which normally would be 2 or 3 meetings in a day. So I think we are seeing a shift to a much more productive and carbon-friendly route to what we're doing. And I think what we'll see post this crisis is that face-to-face meetings are special for where they're needed, but not the routine. Whereas historically, it's been a conference tool that's been unusual. So I think that's a really big silver lining for me. And I think the other one is the thing I referred to earlier, which is I think that we are going to see, particularly small freelancers, creatives, and so on, coming up with new ideas, new approaches, and delivering new services that many of us haven't even thought of yet.
And Matt, something you'd agree with there?
Yeah, I'd echo a lot of that. I think there's been some really interesting and inspiring stories come through from our members, from freelancers in general, that we're seeing just fantastic creativity permeating and showing a lot of people what can be done with very little resources. We've got members who are at home creating collaborative photo shoots through their laptop, producing work with 4 or 5 other people digitally, and opening up that level of creativity is a really exciting possibility moving forwards. We're seeing snippets of compassion from a neighbor playing the cello on the roof to the claps that resonate at 8 o'clock on Thursdays. And I'm hopeful that we're going to hang on to some of these compassionate moments and move them forward into a space where it's not so money hungry, it's not so cutthroat around a very single-minded capitalist concept, but rather a space where we can be slightly more human and treat each other with a little bit more respect. And that feeds into a lot of the conversation that Philip and I would have around unpaid work or exploitation of freelancers. If we can see people as people and not as a number on a bank statement or spreadsheet, I think we're going to have a much broader and more fulfilling economy and place to work. So I'm very hopeful. I see a huge number of positives in what's happening at the moment. And I think it's going to be a very interesting few weeks that hopefully will spawn a lot of new ideas and creativity.
So some glimmers of light there to hold on to, but in the meantime, both organisations doing a huge amount of work and a huge amount of campaigning and offering a lot of practical resource. So if you are struggling, whether it's to get invoices paid or you are looking for some more tailored advice, please do reach out to the respective organisations, the Freelancer Club and the Small Business Commissioner. Matt and Philip, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for the questions. If we didn't get round to them today, we will definitely be looking at doing more of these in the future, or feel free to email either Matt or Philip. I'm sure they'd be delighted to hear from you and provide more advice. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks, Philip.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.